Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
I don't know of a region of America that buys its, that believes its own propaganda so much as the American West, you know. It was always a lie, it was always a ghost, it was always a myth, a story. It's not real.
Coming up, a conversation with author Claire Vaye Watkins, whose stories both celebrate the American West and strip it bare. That's Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. Author Claire Vaye Watkins has already experienced a lot more than most others her age. Her father, who died of cancer when she was only 6, was once an associate of convicted murderer Charles Manson and eventually testified against him. Her mother died by suicide when Watkins was in her 20s. Now in her 30s, Watkins both resists being known for, quote, a hierarchy of suffering and threads her pain through her fictional works. Raised in several Mojave Desert towns, she sets many of her storylines there. Those include her award-winning short story collection, Battleborn, and her newest work, the novel Gold Fame Citrus. A recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Story Prize, and the Dylan Thomas Prize, Watkins is a professor at the University of Michigan. I spoke with her at the 2016 Sun Valley Writers Conference to learn more about the nexus between her writing and her life. Well, welcome to Idaho. Welcome back to the West.
Thank you.
What does it feel like coming back home? You live in Michigan right now.
I
during
do,
the year,
yeah.
Right? So
I'm in exile in Ann Arbor, yes. It's wonderful to come back. I actually just spent all last month in Nevada, so I'm really replenished. And so this being in Idaho is just kind of gravy to be around the mountains. And yeah, it's so essential for me to get back and replenish and figure out what I'm interested in and why. And for some reason, no region really speaks to me like the Southwest. So
you're garnishing yourself with little Idaho flowers too. Mm-hmm. They're beautiful. Is that those picked from around here?
Yeah, I picked them from the resort. The nice landscaping people got some input from me today about flowers. Yeah, I was saying it's part. I'm going for part Frida Kahlo, part Joy Williams.
Idaho features in part of your newest novel, Gold Fame Citrus, two of the characters, and we'll talk about the story in a little bit. They're trying to flee California, which is drying up, and trying to figure out where to go. And the woman says, I read there are these mountains near Boise where the sun sets and they turn purple every day. Something about the altitude, and then the foothills are these marshes, and in the spring they pulse this electric green. You almost can't look at them. And then she goes on to say, Idaho is golden. So where did you get that image, and why did you want to put Idaho in that story as some place to flee to?
Well, so the book kind of imagines the culmination of the water crisis in California, or the mega drought, as it's being called now. And I think that Idaho exists mostly in the imagination of the characters. I spent some time in Boise and some time in the mountains here and there, but I don't know it well enough to have a specific site in mind. But I bet there is such a place with that pulses green and purple mountains. It's not hard.
Sure,
for
it's
me
Boise,
to
of
believe.
course.
Yeah, right.
I mean, you said it is, so
I think Boise's a wonderful,
actually,
stunning place.
It does get purple light on it, as you described.
Wow.
And in the spring, it can get electric green, not for very long, but.
Yeah, that's.
But it's the Idaho of the imagination.
Right. Yeah. So I was thinking, what would somebody who'd lived in California her whole life, and her life sort of marks the drastic intensification of the water crisis. And so by the time she's an adult and they're thinking about where should we go, we have to relocate to somewhere. I wondered, she fantasizes about moist places and about mountains and about snow. She's never seen snow in her whole life. She's never really been anywhere up high and thinking about like what would that mean to her was interesting to me.
Now, the book has sometimes been described as dystopian or apocalyptic, in this sense that, people are just trying to either flee from this roiling sand dune sea,
Right.
or they're trying to make a go of it in these, strange communities.
Right.
But the science part of it is very much real, isn't it? I mean, you talk to scientists to try and figure out what this future might look like where the water goes away.
That's true, yeah. I talked to, I remember a very memorable conversation I had with a geographer who specializes in the California Central Valley. And I told him, here's this book I'm working on, I'm about halfway done, and here's the premise. It's basically as bad as things could get for California during the drought. And then I told him the whole premise of the book and what happens in the plot. And afterwards he said, oh, well, that's not nearly as bad as it could get. And it was just like, I kept, that would happen over and over again. Like my imagination kept failing and paling in comparison to reality, to I was trying to write a book of like surrealism and satire almost, like not realism, not anything that would really happen, like sort of high concept, zany Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy kind of thing. But my research kept tugging me back to reality. And so I would come up with something bonkers, like, oh, what if they put a drain in the bottom of Lake Mead, right? And sort of drained it like a bathtub. That's a crazy image. I'm going to put that in the book. And then a quick Google shows that such a drain already exists, actually. It was under construction when I was writing the book. And I believe the week the book was published, the citizens of Las Vegas started drinking the water that came from that downspout.
I learned a new phrase when I was researching this interview, cli-fi.
Me too, yeah. That was a new term.
Climate fiction.
Climate fiction, yeah. It's not, as I originally thought, a new subgenre of erotica. No. I think cli-fi, as I understand it, it's not a genre that I'm really widely read in, I should say. But having accidentally written some of it, I think one of the markers is that cli-fi, what we're doing is trying to put our heads around a really difficult to conceive concept like climate change. Like it's really hard for us to think about 60 years in the future, let alone like 600 years in the future, right?
But this is not a polemic about climate change and wanting people to change the way they live, is it?
Well, I started out saying no, not at all, because I've been kind of trained to be allergic to the polemic, and I think it's an adage of contemporary fiction that you ought not tell the reader what to think, and you certainly should not tell them what you think. But, when you read the book, it's very obvious that the book is like almost like a eulogy for a place that is really important to me, the American Southwest, and it's really mournful, and it absolutely has a position, and that position is like we have to do something. I mean, it's arguably too late to make a real impact, but I don't know. It's sort of like this. What kind of people do we want to be? Like, do we want to be as Americans and as human beings and as Southwesterners and as people who are descended from pioneers, and the American West, as far as Europeans have been present there, is like the foundation is genocide, right? Like Manifest Destiny is genocide, and it's built on that foundation. And so I kind of have come to think of climate change as this chance for us to change the story and start to like behave in a more moral and environmentally ethical position in a region that has really not had very much of that. It's a very take consumptive type of ethos in the American West.
So Gold Fame Citrus comes from a comment that a character made in the book about why people came west. But the character goes on to say mirage.
Right.
And it seems to me, both in your novel, in that novel, and in your short stories, much of what I sense when I read is this theme of mirage.
Yeah.
Like we're going towards something, we keep going towards it's not there.
Right.
We keep going. I almost felt as if the book could be just called Mirage.
Yeah, that, believe it or not, that was a proposed title. Yeah, and I think it is, sadly, the myths of the American West still need quite a bit of debunking and interrogation. There's a version of the story of the American West that completely erases all indigenous people, which is in itself really troubling, but more so because they were murdered, and like people of Europe, Americans of European descent, killed them off, killed the buffalo, raped, ravaged, and pillaged the land, and then we act as if we discovered California. We act as if we, that the United States somehow made the Sierra Nevadas. Like, no, they were there for, millions of years, and there were whole, important, sophisticated cultures that had art and law and religion and migration and architecture. They were there, right? So that's just one example of the ways in which we still are. I don't know of a region, including the South, I don't know of a region of America that buys its, that believes its own propaganda so much as the American West. You can read brochures about all the perks of traveling west on the Overland Trail to California, which were lies when they were written. The American West as a place was essentially like made up by Owen Wister and Teddy Roosevelt after the collapse of open range agriculture. It was always a lie. It was always a ghost. It was always a myth, a story. It's not real. It's not real at all. And yet we talk about it as if we truly deserve to be in, say, California, and we deserve to gobble up resources at every whim. Why? Because we are divinely placed there. Well, sorry, but no.
This is a scene that your father knew pretty well, and you've written quite extensively about your father's relationship as a right-hand man of Charles Manson. So are you imagining through this book, because I know he died when you were 6, are you imagining some of the things that he might have seen when he went to the desert, because he was sent there to find a hideout for the Manson family? And we should say that he did not participate in the Tate LaBianca murders, and in fact testified against Manson.
Yeah, he was in Death Valley when the Tate LaBianca murders happened.
In this locale that you're writing about.
I think you might be onto something there, though it's not something that I was entirely conscious of as I was writing. But there is a way in which the book kind of imagines. I think, having spent a lot of time thinking about my father and trying to imagine him, because he died when I was so young, I never really got to know him. I've come to think that the desert really saved him. Like, it really changed his life, and it was his immediate salvation. And that's when I think he found something really intensely spiritual and important out there. And I don't know exactly what it was because I don't have access to it. But I think I am when I go there, I feel a similar type of, I feel just like the filling of my own emotional and spiritual well. And so I wanted readers to feel that. I'm not a believer in the desert or in remote locations as wastelands, or as, we talk about the middle of nowhere, or we talk about those places being, they're barren or they're empty. That just is totally wrong as far as I'm concerned. They're really teeming with a certain type of vibrancy and life. It just isn't like a strip mall or a ski resort, but that's not to say that there isn't a really important, wild spaces are really vital just to being alive, I think.
In addition to the setting being reminiscent of where you grew up and that your father knew, the story itself revolves around, as you mentioned, there's a love triangle, there's a couple, and then there's another man who kind of runs this cult-like group in the
sand dune area.
Right.
And, you know, folks can't help as well but be referential and look at,
Yeah.
think about the Manson family
Right.
as well, and drawing upon that.
Well, yeah, and you know, I couldn't help it myself when I was writing it, so I don't expect a reader to resist the comparison. The character Levi, the cult leader that you're talking about, he's a dowser. He has this gift where he can find water. You know, we have the dowsing rods, right? And the original title for the book was The Dowsers, and I wanted that title to sort of emphasize this searching quality, searching for water, and searching also for a type of spiritual fulfillment. And I think in a very literal way, Levi and his followers are searching for the kind of thing that maybe my father was searching for when he met Charles Manson. For my father, it seems from his writing and his talks, and from my family stories and my mother's stories, and from stories of other people involved in the Manson family, that he was very, it was first and foremost an artistic connection between my father and Charlie, as he called Charles Manson. It's a little strange to talk about Charles Manson as like a family friend, but that's how we do it. So he and Charlie, what they really bonded over was not drugs or sex, although of course there's plenty of that, but it was music and making music, and that they, I think, found artistic kindreds in each other. And I often, as an artist, I really feel for him that his artistic kindred turned out to be a murderous maniac, because, you know, he lost that. Like, he was, you know, bereft, and it took a lot of deprogramming, as he called it, and it took being out in the desert and being alone, and being with himself, and being with and finding other expressions for his artistic outlet in music and art making and jewelry and prospecting and finding rocks, for him to extract himself from Charlie. So I'm interested in, I don't know, the idea that it was also a kind of artistic and spiritual failing, the Manson murders. You know, my father was 17 when he met Charles Manson, which I try to remind myself whenever I become too pious or judgmental of him and his position. Particularly, his role in the Manson family was to recruit women, because he was very handsome. And the women, of course, were the ones who were truly, truly exploited, you know, in being persuaded to carry out these murders, and also just on a day-to-day basis. It seems like they were used in many different degrading ways there at Spahn's Ranch. So I'm a woman and a mother of a daughter, and I feel more ambivalent than ever about my father's legacy as like a recruiter of women for the Manson family. But he was 17 years old and very lost, and gosh, I don't wish on my worst enemy that they're whatever they're up to when they're 17 gets recorded on CNN and Larry King, right?
I know that you delivered this manuscript, what, a week before you gave birth yourself?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And your own mom, unfortunately, died when you were about to go into graduate school.
Right.
So, again, you know, I mean, it might be irksome for people to ask you about how this is related to your being and your life experiences.
No, it's not irksome at all. Actually, I think that that's like a basic, like that's my whole aesthetic, is to invite the reader to feel that what's happening on the page is so real that it must have really happened, or that I want the reader to feel like they're reading a confession, or something like, oh, I can't believe she's telling us this about how she feels about her mother's suicide, or her father's involvement with the Manson family, or her own maternal ambivalence, you know. So it's a great compliment to me when someone says, did this really happen? And I just think, like, yes, that's everything. And I mean, fiction, that's the magic of it. It's just ink and papyrus, but somehow it becomes real in the brain of someone, you know, we've never met before when you read my book. And I hope at least you felt some things, and that's a kind of telepathy, or like, you know, telepathic puppetry or something of the soul. It's just incredible. I love it. So thank you. But I don't have a really great answer as to what percentage is true or real, but I very much wanted it to feel 100% real and intimate and urgent that way.
What is the gift that your mom gave you, or the gifts that your mom gave you? She did leave this earth early. She died by suicide, but she has to be still with you in some ways. I know she was a storyteller herself.
Right. Right.
And
What a huge question. We could have a whole other episode just about like
Yeah.
moms and their our maternal inheritance as women. I mean, I think that one thing that my mom gave me is the West in a way that it became inextricably a part of me. So she was the one who, you know, we lived way out in the Mojave Desert on the edge of Death Valley. And when you live like that, you drive a lot. You're in the car a lot. And when we drove, she told stories. And she barely had a high school education. She had no college to speak of. But she was sort of a self-taught naturalist and an amateur geologist. She ran a rock shop and a museum. She was a you know, self-styled cultural historian, and she would, I mean, this is well before I knew any of those terms at all. Those are words I had learned in college, but that's what we were doing. She was a feminist and a natural historian and a naturalist before I even know what those were. And we would drive, and she would tell us everything from like, see that house out there? This is who lives there, and this is their story. To see that mountain there? It was a volcano. Or see this ridge? It was all once underwater. And I think I really internalized, you know, that way of seeing the world and the natural world as full of stories and full of narrative. So she taught me how to see stories in the world, really.
And your dad, because what's really interesting is he's left behind, you know, there's a TV show that, or an interview with him you can watch with Maureen Reagan interviewing him on Larry King Live.
Right.
There's recordings that he made, both video and audio. What do you think his legacy is that lives on in you?
Well, as a storyteller, I think it's clear if you spend a little bit of time with the material regarding my father and the Manson family, those interviews on CNN and his recordings, that I would never be a linear, straightforward storyteller. You know, that my stories are kind of they're asking a lot more questions than they answer. They're playful, they're kind of a little bit cagey. They don't offer any great big truth, right? Like, I'm not writing a book that says, I know why the Manson family murders happened. No, I don't have that story. I'm not writing a Manson family memoir. I'm writing a short story that looks and pretends to be a Manson family memoir that has a ghost in it, right? Like, and that's because when you go, as I did, as a young person, at the same time I was coming of age as a writer, I was obsessively curious about my dad, and I wanted to know, well, I just wanted to have a dad. I just wanted to have the wisdom and the love that he might have, if he were alive, he might have offered me. So I'm kind of like trying to read between the lines of an interview he's doing on Larry King Live, and I'm almost wanting a secret message. Like, I'm like looking at him and saying like, am I going to be okay? I need you. Do you have anything for me? It's like a ghost in the machine type of thing. And every once in a while, believe it or not, mostly it's a failed search. You know, it's another one of those things that I'm not going to get the answer I'm looking for. But every once in a while, I get something. Like, I listened to a recording. People would write to him about the Manson family, especially people who had been struggling with addiction or indoctrinated into other cults. They would write to him and ask his advice, and then he would record tapes and send them out as letters. And somebody sent me one of those, and in it he said, there's nothing wrong with not knowing who you are. And he was talking to someone else completely different, but I was like, that's for me. I think that's for me. That's what I needed to hear.
What were the things that helped you get through not having a father for most of your life and then losing your mother so young, rather, just as you're going into graduate school? Where does that strength come from?
Well, I don't know. I don't feel particularly strong. It's just when you I mean, what's the other option? You know, like I think there is something kind of, maybe there is something brave in just putting one foot in front of the other day after day, but that's what everybody who isn't killing themselves is doing. And I didn't want to be that person. Like I've seen how that went with my mom, and I don't think I'll ever, you know, knock on wood here in Hemingway country, I don't think I'll ever have that thought. I don't think I'll ever entertain the thought of suicide. And I also have my sisters. My sisters are just like totally vital to me, and Battleborn is essentially a love song to them. And
your books so clearly describe lives that many people in our country don't see, but
Right.
that many people in our country experience
Are
on
living,
a daily
yeah.
basis.
Right.
You have lived poverty, you have felt poverty,
Right.
you have eaten or not eaten poverty. I mean,
Right.
you have been poor. And that, it seems to me, propels some of the language and scenes in your work,
Yeah.
both in the novel and in your short stories.
yeah, I have basically like working class survivor guilt. And I think this is something that a phrase or idea that was first introduced to me by Dorothy Allison, is like the poor kid who gets out of it, you know, gets to go to college or gets to publish a book or gets to become a professor or whatever. Like we're all carrying all of our loved ones who didn't get to do any of that, which is not to say that living in poverty isn't living. It's just so difficult. And I have a real problem with I see now all kinds of stories that we as a culture tell about poor people, that they're lazy or that they don't work hard or that they're not as smart. Those are all, of course, I don't think I can swear on public radio, but they're BS. So that's the kind of thing I'm interested in writing about these days.
Well, I know for one that I'll be really, really looking forward to whatever it is that you decide to write after
Thanks.
looking around at the world and sensing the world and looking at maybe through the eyes of your new child.
Yeah.
So
Thank
you
you.
so much for
My
taking
pleasure.
the time
My
to
pleasure.
talk
It's
with
been a
me.
blast.
I really
Thanks.
appreciate it.
Likewise.
You've been listening to author Claire Vaye Watkins, whose latest book is Gold, Fame, Citrus. Our conversation was taped at the 2016 Sun Valley Writers Conference. Thanks to the organizers of that renowned event for allowing us to conduct interviews there for a decade now. To learn more, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.